The girl slammed into the snow like a broken bird, blood blooming red across the white drifts. Her bare feet cut trails in the frost, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with terror. Yet even as her body gave out, her hands refused to release the rawhide bundle she carried. Jonas Whitlock froze at the fence line, rifle halfway to his shoulder. He had seen soldiers collapse on battlefields, but never like this, alone, stumbling out of a storm, hunted by something unseen. From the ridge came shadows, riders dark against the pale horizon, moving slow but steady, like death with spurs. The wind screamed through the valley, carrying a warning only Jonas seemed to hear. He didn't know her name, he only knew one truth. Whatever hunted her was still out there, and it was coming closer. New Mexico Territory, winter of 1872. Snow had no business lying over desert rock, yet it clung stubbornly to the plains that stretched endless in every direction. The land was a contradiction, red stone mesas cut sharp against skies heavy with gray, sagebrush buried half in ice, the promise of a whiteout storm crouched just beyond the mountains. Jonas's ranch sat stranded in this lonely valley, a scattering of weather-beaten boards and broken fences pressed against the wind. It was the kind of place forgotten by lawmen, where a man lived by his hands, his rifle, and the silence of his own company. Winter here was not a season, it was a sentence. Each gust rattled the shutters like the voice of judgment, reminding any soul who lingered that the land showed no mercy. And into this merciless country had come a girl, bleeding, clutching secrets worth killing for. The war had ended 7 years ago, but the New Mexico frontier still felt like a battlefield. Treaties were ink on paper, easily torn when land and gold whispered louder. Union veterans drifted west, carrying ghosts in their saddlebags, while Apache bands fought to hold on to valleys their ancestors had bled for. In town, men still wore pistols on their hips, not from pride, but because peace never seemed certain. Every saloon corner whispered about broken promises, missing survey maps, and soldiers who lined their pockets by selling what wasn't theirs to sell. Out here, justice was as thin as the winter air. Jonas Whitlock knew it well. He'd marched under Union blue, watched orders turn into graves, and returned with medals he never cared to show. The nation might call it Reconstruction. To men like him, it was just another name for ruin. Jonas lived alone on a patch of land too small to matter to the cattle garrons and too poor to tempt thieves. A one-room cabin, a half-collapsed barn, and a windmill that squealed in every gale. Neighbors were days away, and he liked it that way. Silence had become his closest ally. Once there had been laughter here. His wife, Mary, had planted lilacs by the door. Their little boy used to chase chickens until dusk. But a sickness swept through the army camp downriver, and by the time Jonas found help, the graves were dug. 2 mounds side by side, 1 silver cross. He had hammered it himself, and every morning since he touched it as though it were the last living part of them. The town spoke his name rarely. Some said the war had hollowed him. Others said the plague had broken him. Jonas didn't bother correcting either. He rose before dawn, worked until his hands cracked, ate in silence, prayed without words. Life had become a duty, not a gift. And yet, when he saw the girl crumple against his fence line, clutching her bundle like it was her soul, something inside him stirred. Not hope, he'd buried that, but recognition. The kind a dying man feels when he sees another trying to outrun death itself. Snow hissed sideways across the valley as Jonas swung the gate shut. The storm had a voice, and tonight it sounded hungry. He was halfway to the cabin when he saw it, movement by the fence line. At first he thought it was a coyote dragging itself across the drifts, but then the shape staggered upright. A figure, human. She emerged from the white blur like a vision torn between this world and the next. Barefoot, her hair matted with ice, a torn deerskin hanging loose around her shoulders. Blood soaked one side of her arm, dark against the snow. For a heartbeat, she stared at him with eyes wide as the moon, then stumbled forward, clutching something wrapped in rawhide to her chest. Jonas raised his rifle out of instinct, the way a man does when the past screams louder than reason. Apache. The word slammed into him like musket fire. He'd buried his family because of a sickness that spread from the camps, but in his mind it was all tangled with raids, with war cries in the night. His finger tensed. But then she collapsed against the fence, crumpling like a rag doll, the bundle still clutched in her arms. Her lips cracked open, breath barely there. "Don't let them take it." Then she went still. Only the wind moved. Jonas stood frozen, rifle shaking in his hands as the storm swallowed the horizon. And somewhere beyond the ridge, he swore he heard hooves. Jonas knelt beside her, torn between fury and something far heavier. Up close, she looked impossibly young, her face streaked with soot and snow, her body bruised by more than weather. Whatever ghosts chased her had left marks no blizzard could hide. His eyes dropped to the rawhide bundle, a parfleche, worn but sealed tight. Whatever was inside had been worth bleeding for, and worth killing for. He looked toward the ridge. The riders he'd glimpsed earlier were gone from sight, but the wind carried their promise. They would be here soon. He could leave her in the snow, let the storm and the riders finish what they had started. No one in town would judge him for it. Some might even call it justice. But when he turned back toward the cabin, his eyes caught the silver cross nailed above his door. Mary's cross. His hand lifted without thinking, brushing the cold metal, and a verse he hadn't spoken in years rose in his chest. "Remember those in chains, as if you were together with them." Hebrews 13:3. Jonas closed his eyes, exhaling like a man stepping off a cliff. When they opened again, his rifle was slung across his back, his arms lifting the girl out of the snow. By carrying her, he was carrying more than flesh and bone. He was shouldering a burden that would either damn him or save him. Either way, the silence of his ranch was gone forever. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. Jonas Whitlock kept his hand steady, though his heart was anything but. The Apache girl's shoulder wound had closed some, but infection lingered like a wolf circling a wounded deer. He'd boiled the water twice, just the way Doc Everett used to drill into him, and now he laid a clean strip of linen across the angry red mark. The girl winced, breath hissing between her teeth. Jonas muttered, "Easy now," in a voice rough from years of disuse, as if he were coaxing a spooked mare. Her name, Nahla, had slipped from her lips the night before when fever broke. He tried it under his breath, uncertain on his tongue. Nahla. She turned her head at the sound, dark eyes meeting his. No accusation, no thanks, only watchfulness, as if weighing whether this weathered rancher was danger or shield. The days found a rhythm. Morning light bled pale over the high desert, and Jonas set a bowl of corn mush before her. She tasted it cautiously, then tapped her chest with 2 fingers. Nahla. Jonas nodded, tapped his own chest. Jonas. A slow exchange, a fragile thread across languages. Soon water, fire, bread followed. Her halting English answered with his clumsy Apache. They laughed once, short, startled, when Jonas pointed at a chicken and mangled the Apache words so badly the hen squawked in protest. In the quiet of those evenings, Jonas felt something stir he thought long buried. She insisted on helpin', even with her wound, gatherin' kindlin', sweepin' dirt from the floor with one good arm. Once, as she moved about the cramped kitchen, Jonas caught himself remembering the sound of his wife humming while she kneaded dough, and his boy's giggles when he tried to swipe a hot biscuit before supper. The ache returned sharp, but layered now with something gentler. It wasn't family, not yet, maybe never, but it was the echo of family, and echoes still filled a house better than silence. One night, snow pressed against the windows, and the wind groaned in the eaves. Jonas had made stew, thin but hot, and set it between them. Nahla bowed her head briefly before eating. The gesture unlocked another memory. His son, eyes closed tight, reciting grace in a voice too eager for the words. Jonas cleared his throat, murmuring, "Lord, bless this food." He hadn't spoken such words in years. Nahla looked up at the sound, and though she didn't understand, she smiled softly, as if she recognized prayer in any tongue. Day by day, color returned to her cheeks, though the limp lingered, and her strength rebuilt like a cabin beam by beam. Jonas caught himself watching for her footsteps in the house, listening for the scrape of a chair or the faint murmur of Apache syllables. The silence that had wrapped his ranch for so long was cracking, letting in something warmer. And yet, beneath the hearth's glow, Jonas knew storms gathered. Men like Bledsoe and Jeb weren't ones to forget. But for now, for this evening, with snow deep outside and fire bright within, Jonas allowed himself a rare thing, the sense he wasn't alone anymore. The snow had thinned into crusts of gray slush by the time Jonas rode down the rutted track toward town. His list was short: salt, flour, maybe a spool of thread, but the weight in his chest was heavy as a pack mule. He hadn't walked Main Street in weeks, not since the night he carried Nahla bleeding across his porch. Each mile closer, the questions mounted. Would anyone know? And if they did, what would their silence cost? The church bell tolled noon as Jonas dismounted by the mercantile. Reverend Cole stood near the steps, black coat hanging loose on his thin frame. The old minister's eyes found Jonas immediately. For a breath, Jonas thought the man might raise a hand in greeting. Instead, Cole's gaze swept past, fixed suddenly on the frozen ruts underfoot. Only the faint dip of his chin, so slight it might have been a trick of light, betrayed acknowledgement. Jonas carried that weight inside like a stone. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with flour dust. Two women at the counter stopped talking when Jonas entered. One fiddled with her bonnet strings, the other pretended to study the bolts of cloth. He picked up his sack of salt in silence, laid down coins, and left without a word. Behind him, the door clicked shut too quickly, as though the shopkeeper was eager to seal him outside. On the board nailed beside the sheriff's office, a handbill flapped in the wind. Jonas's eyes snagged on the words, "Reward posted. Apache fugitive at large. Suspected murderer of settlers." The sketch was crude, but close enough. His throat tightened. He felt Reverend Cole's eyes again across the street, watching, then turning away. That evening, on his way back toward the ranch, Jonas reined his horse near the back door of a clapboard house. A lantern flickered faint inside. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Dr. Samuel Everett stepped into the cold, his coat collar high. The physician glanced left, right, then slipped a small bundle into Jonas's hand. Dried herbs, vials corked tight. "You didn't get these from me," Everett murmured, his voice low as the crunch of snow. "Word is spreading faster than the fever. Careful who you trust, Jonas." Jonas studied the man, the way his hands trembled slightly. He wanted to ask why Everett, who had once stitched his son's arm after a fall, wouldn't stand taller now. But the doctor had already stepped back, retreating into shadow, as if his own doorway might devour him. The ride home stretched long and silent. Jonas's horse snorted clouds into the dusk. Each shuttered window he passed in town replayed in his mind. The minister's silence, the doctor's half-help, the townsfolk who averted their eyes. Fear had choked them into complicity. He couldn't say they were wrong. He had done the same often enough, keeping his head low, his mouth shut. Wasn't that how a man survived out here? Yet as the ranch rose dark against the horizon, Jonas's gut twisted. Survive, maybe, but at what cost? Nahla's fragile breaths in his cabin, the way she tried to sweep dirt with one good arm, the whisper of her voice when she repeated English words, those things pressed against the silence of town like flame against dry kindling. For the first time in years, Jonas wondered if the Reverend's quiet nod and Everett's warning were not enough. Perhaps silence itself was the disease running deeper than any fever. And if that were true, maybe he was sicker than he'd ever admitted. The canyon walls held the echoes of pain longer than any man's scream. Jeb Crow's boot ground into the frozen mud as he leaned over the Apache scout tied to a mesquite post. The man's face was bruised, his wrists raw from the rope. Jeb's gloved hand closed around the haft of his bowie knife, tracing a slow line across the prisoner's cheek. Not deep, just enough to bleed. "You'll talk," Jeb drawled, eyes pale as winter sky. "Every one of you dogs leaves tracks. Where's the girl?" The scout spat blood into the dirt. Jeb smiled thinly. Then, without ceremony, he shoved the man backward, rope snapping taut, and let him hang gasping against the post. A moment later, Jeb sliced the cord. The body dropped limply into the mud. He wiped the knife on his coat and muttered, "Worthless." Hoofbeats clattered. From the ledge above, Captain Silas Bledsoe appeared, uniform coat buttoned crisp despite the cold. His polished boots and brass buttons caught the faint light, marks of order masking the rot beneath. "You never could pace yourself," Bledsoe said as he dismounted, eyes flicking to the dead Apache, with no more concern than a man stepping over trash. Jeb shrugged. "Fear works faster than silver." Bledsoe ignored the remark, pulling a weathered map from his satchel. The parchment was torn at the edges, creased so often the ink bled into ghostly lines. Red X's marked parcels of land. Their land, the Apache valleys where water still ran and grass stayed green. "By spring, this ground will be surveyed," Bledsoe said, voice flat. "But the ink won't be Apache. It'll be mine. Gold men are waiting back east, pockets open. All they need is a signed treaty, and I've drafted one convincing enough to fool Congress." He slipped a sealed envelope from his coat. The edge glittered where wax caught the light. Inside, gold coins clinked softly. Payment, bribe, or blood price, it hardly mattered. Jeb hooked a thumb toward the lifeless scout. "And the girl? She carries the real papers, don't she? The ones that prove your ink's just smoke." For the first time, Bledsoe's jaw tightened. He bent, retrieving his officer's badge from where it had slipped loose in the saddle. A smear of blood streaked the silver star. He pinned it back on without wiping it clean. "Find her," Bledsoe said, low and sharp, "before someone like Turner hides her too well. We can't afford a whisper of truth, not when I'm this close." Jeb grinned, teeth flashing white in the dusk. "Truth don't travel far with a rope round its neck." He spat into the dirt, swung into his saddle, and rode off, boots drumming like war drums against the canyon floor. Bledsoe lingered, watching until the outlaw disappeared behind the bend. His hand pressed the map flat against his thigh, fingers tracing each valley like a man caressing gold already in his pocket. Above him, the wind shifted, scattering dust over the dead scout at his feet. He didn't look down. The captain swung into his saddle, the blood-stained badge catching the last light of day, and turned toward town. Behind him, the canyon fell silent again, save for the whisper of cold wind dragging across the mud, carrying with it the promise of more graves to come. The fire had burned down to coals, their glow casting faint circles against the cabin walls. Outside, the winter wind pressed hard against the shutters, rattling them like bones in a barrel. Nahla sat close, her knees drawn to her chest, the blanket Jonas had given her wrapped tight around her shoulders. She hadn't spoken for nearly an hour. Jonas thought she'd fallen asleep. He stirred the coals, the iron poker scraping softly. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "They will hang them at dawn, 3 dawns from now." Jonas turned. Her eyes glistened in the firelight, wide and unblinking. He set the poker down slowly. "What did you say?" Nahla swallowed, her voice trembling but steady. "Captain Bledsoe. He plans to hang 6 of my people. Elders, warriors. He says their blood will seal the treaty he forged. If no one signs, he will kill them anyway to make the rest obey." The words filled the small cabin like smoke, choking out the warmth of the fire. Jonas rubbed a hand over his beard, his gut turning to stone. He'd heard rumors of Bledsoe's cruelty, but rumors had never carried faces. Nahla's eyes did. 3 days, Jonas repeated, voice rough. "That's no time at all." Nahla reached forward, grasping his sleeve. "I tell you because you gave me shelter, you fed me. If I die, it changes nothing. But if they die, my people's spirit dies with them. You must understand." For a long moment, Jonas couldn't meet her gaze. He looked instead at the shutter, where cold light leaked through cracks, where the night pressed harder with every gust. He felt the old ache stir, the one he buried years ago with his wife and boy. Back then, he'd told himself some fights weren't his to fight. But now the choice stood breathing in front of him. He rose and crossed the room, pacing slow, boots scuffing the wood. He thought of the townfolk turning their faces away, Reverend Cole's silence, Dr. Everett's warning. Maybe he wasn't so different. Maybe he'd been hiding behind quiet all this time, just like them. The fire popped, throwing sparks. He stopped, staring at Nahla. She looked so small under the blanket, but her eyes held a weight that pressed against his chest harder than any winter storm. "If I keep you here, safe," Jonas muttered half to himself, "the world goes on just the same. And if I do nothing," his fists closed, "then I'm no better than them." Silence settled heavy again, broken only by the groan of the wind. Jonas felt the night closing around the cabin like a noose tightening. The stars outside would burn cold and bright, but dawn was already rushing closer. Nahla lowered her gaze, voice barely audible. "I did not mean to bind you to this, but once you know, you cannot unknow." Jonas crouched near her, his face set in iron lines. For the first time in years, his voice carried something harder than weariness, something like resolve. He leaned close, words low, steady, meant for her ears alone. "Then we don't have 3 days to waste." The first sign came at dawn. From the ridge above the valley, a ribbon of gray smoke curled skyward, thick and restless, as though the mountain itself exhaled a warning. Jonas tightened the cinch on his bay gelding, eyes narrowed against the pale horizon. "That's no campfire," he muttered. Nahla followed his gaze, her face paling. "The old people say gray smoke from the peaks means the storm is already awake." They pushed on. The trail wound down to a half-frozen creek where a narrow bridge of split timbers stretched across. The wood sagged under frost. The kind of bridge Jonas wouldn't trust with a herd, but on horseback it might hold. He dismounted first, leading his gelding across while the creek gurgled beneath, ice breaking in jagged shards. Nahla followed, clutching the parfleche tight against her chest. Halfway over, the timbers groaned like dying lungs. Jonas whipped his head back. "Don't stop, keep moving!" Nahla's boots slipped on the frost-slick planks. Jonas lunged, grabbing her wrist just as the bridge cracked loud as rifle fire. For an instant, horse, man, girl, and wood seemed to hang weightless. Then the far end of the bridge split apart, dropping away into the icy torrent. Jonas hauled Nahla forward with all his weight, throwing them both onto the opposite bank as the bridge tore free and crashed into the current. Spray of ice water soaked them to the bone. Nahla's gasp cut the air. The parfleche slipped from her arms, spinning toward the creek. Jonas snatched it mid-fall, clutching it tight before shoving it back into her hands. "Don't let go of this again," he barked, voice harder than he meant. Her wide eyes nodded the answer. Behind them, hoofbeats cracked like whips. Jeb Crow's men appeared on the ridge, rifles slung, their laughter carrying thin in the cold. But nature moved faster than steel. Clouds rolled in from the peaks, swallowing sunlight in one long breath. The valley darkened, the air sharpened. Then the storm came down. Snow ripped across the land like a white wall, wind howling so fierce Jonas had to lean into it just to stand. It drove needles of ice into their skin, stripped the heat from their bones. Nahla clung to his sleeve as he pulled her into the cover of pines. Branches snapped overhead. Horses screamed through the gale, men cursing, their shapes swallowed by the storm's curtain. Jonas glimpsed one rider trying to push his mount across the frozen creek, only to vanish in a cracking roar of ice. The storm wasn't choosing sides, it punished all. They staggered uphill, every step a battle. Snow rose past their knees, crusting their lashes, choking their breath. Jonas could barely hear Nahla's voice above the wind. "If the storm takes us, they win." Her grip on the parfleche was white-knuckled. Jonas forced a grim smile through frozen lips. "Not today. Keep moving." By nightfall, the mountain had closed its fist. The trail was gone, the world reduced to white chaos. They huddled beneath a leaning rock face, shielded from the worst of the gale. Jonas struck a spark with numb fingers, coaxing a flame from scraps of bark. It sputtered, then caught. For a fragile moment, light and warmth pushed back the storm. Nahla leaned close, her teeth chattering. "The storm will bury their tracks as well as ours." Jonas nodded, staring into the fire, snow whipping sideways just beyond reach. "A storm's no friend," he said, voice low, "but sometimes it fights for you." The first sign came not with gunfire, but silence. Jonas returned from chopping wood to find the ranch gate ajar. His gut clenched. On the cabin door, a hunting knife quivered, buried deep into the cedar plank. The blade gleamed cold, a strip of cloth tied to the hilt, a scrap from Nahla's dress, torn when she fled. A warning, sharp and intimate. "We've been here. We can come again." Nahla stood behind him, clutching the parfleche. Her voice trembled. "They are circling us like coyotes." Jonas pulled the knife free, jaw tight. Coyotes don't leave notes. This was Crow's men. He glanced at the tree line, every shadow suddenly alive. The ranch, once a refuge, now felt like a marked grave. That night, with the fire low and the storm pressing its weight against the windows, Nahla finally broke her silence. She untied the leather cords and opened the parfleche across the table. Inside lay a yellowed survey map, stamped with the seal of Fort Carter. Lines cut across valleys and ridges, each mark showing how Apache lands had been sold for pennies through forged deeds. Her finger trembled as it traced a circle of red ink. This is my people's valley, stolen on paper. Jeb Crow holds the false claim. If he burns this proof, no one will believe us. Jonas studied the map, his weathered face hardening. He had lived through lies of land and loss before. His wife's grave was on ground once promised safe. Slowly, he set his calloused hand over Nahla's. Then we don't let them burn it, not this time. The choice was no longer shadowed. He stood with her.
But the enemy moved faster than conviction. 2 days later, a rider came under truce, one of Bledsoe's men, carrying a folded sheet stamped with the captain's seal. Jonas slit it open with the same knife they had found on his door. The words were blunt as iron. "Turn over the Apache girl by sundown, or your ranch will burn with her inside it." Jonas read it twice, heat rising in his chest. Nahla watched his face, searching. "What will you do?" He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Same thing I always do. Stand my ground." But the ground shifted beneath them that very night. Crow's men struck like wolves. Jonas fought them off the porch, firing until his rifle jammed, swinging the stock like a club. In the chaos, one outlaw slipped past, ripping the parfleche from Nahla's arms. She screamed, darting after him, but Jonas pulled her back as the outlaw held the proof high. With a grin wide as a scar, the man struck a match and touched it to the edge. Flame leapt across the dry hide, devouring ink and history in seconds. Jonas lunged, too late. The outlaw flung the burning parfleche onto the snow, laughing as smoke curled skyward.
Jonas stomped the fire out with his boots, but when he lifted the remains, nothing but black ash smeared his hands. The map, their only proof, was gone. For the first time in years, Jonas felt hollow. He sank onto the porch steps, snow settling on his shoulders like burial cloth. His rifle lay useless at his feet. In his palm, he held the small wooden cross he kept since his wife's death. The storm raged, wind keening like a funeral hymn. His lips moved, words rasping into the dark. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Nahla hovered behind him, silent, watching the man who had saved her wrestle with despair. Jonas bowed his head, the scripture steadying his breath. The fight had taken everything, yet, in the hollow, a new fire began. If Crow thought ash meant defeat, he hadn't reckoned on the man rising from it. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Sunday mornings in Dustwater Crossing were usually slow and reverent. The smell of biscuits drifted from kitchen windows. The sound of hymnals floated from the chapel at the far end of the street, and shopkeepers leaned on their doors with the easy patience of a town at rest. But this morning, the hymns were drowned out by something heavier: boots. Dozens of boots striking the boards of Main Street in harsh rhythm. The congregation, already gathered near the church, turned their heads as the soldiers marched into the square. At their center, Bledsoe strode with his hat pulled low, face hard as a cliff. Behind him came Jeb Crow, dragging someone, by the wrist. Gasps tore through the crowd. It was Nahla. Her dark hair hung loose and wild, streaked with blood at the temple. Her wrists were bound cruelly behind her back with rawhide, her dress torn at the shoulder, dust clinging to her bare feet. Jeb shoved her forward, and she stumbled against the wooden platform at the square center. Above it, the gallows beam stretched black against the pale sky. A noose swung lazily in the breeze like a vulture's wing. Bledsoe raised his hand, halting the soldiers. His voice rang out across the square, crisp and merciless. "This girl," he spat, "has been spreading lies about the treaty, poisoning your minds with Apache filth. Let this be a warning. Whoever dares speak falsehoods against this town's law will share her fate." He gestured, and Jeb yanked the rope down, slipping the noose over her head with deliberate slowness. Nahla's chest rose and fell quickly, but she did not beg. Her eyes, sharp, defiant even through the pain, swept the crowd. The townsfolk did what they had always done under Bledsoe's shadow. They looked away. Mothers pulled children close. Shop shutters creaked closed, one after another. Men shifted uncomfortably, their hats pulled lower, each of them hoping the storm would pass if they stayed silent. The gallows creaked as Jeb cinched the rope tighter, and then a voice cut through the hush. "Enough." The word was low, steady, but it carried, echoing down the boardwalk like a rifle crack. Jonas stepped out from between the rows of onlookers. His boots struck the ground with measured weight, each step pushing him deeper into danger.
The sun glinted on the stubble of his jaw, his broad frame cutting a lonely figure against the crowd that instinctively parted for him. People whispered his name, some in disbelief, some in dread. Jonas Hale, the reclusive rancher, the madman who talked to no one, who carried a past like a scar too deep to heal. For years he had been a ghost among them, the kind of man mothers warned their sons about, and fathers spoke of in hushed tones. Now here he was, walking straight into the open with nothing but his resolve. Every pair of eyes in the square followed him. The soldiers tensed. Bledsoe's jaw tightened. Jeb sneered, one hand hovering near his pistol. Nahla's eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. Jonas didn't falter. He mounted the steps of the platform, boots thudding against the wood. The rope swayed between him and the girl, the symbol of everything Bledsoe stood for. There was no retreat now. This was his point of no return. The square seemed to hold its breath. The rope creaked softly above Nahla's head, a vulture's shadow waiting to fall. Bledsoe adjusted his coat, savoring the silence like a stage actor. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he pulled a folded document from his pocket. "This," he declared, voice ringing sharp against the quiet street, "is the treaty, signed by the Apache themselves, witnessed by this very town. Proof of peace and proof of her lies." He raised the paper high for all to see. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some strained to glimpse it, others only nodded, cowed by his certainty. But Nahla, her wrists bound and throat raw, lifted her chin. Her voice, hoarse but unbroken, slipped into the Apache tongue. Words as old as the mesas, fierce as the mountain wind. The foreign syllables rose over the square, halting, unafraid. Then she translated, her accent trembling, but her meaning cutting clean. "He twists the words of my people. The treaty you hold is false. The land you live on was stolen, signed under the knife, not the pen." Gasps broke the silence. A few townsfolk exchanged uncertain glances. Bledsoe's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the paper. And then another voice wavered through the air. "Sheriff Bledsoe," came the trembling tone of Dr. Samuel Everett. The old physician stepped forward from the crowd, pale and sweating.
His hands shook as he clutched something, a crumpled scrap of paper pulled from the depths of his worn satchel. The crowd parted as he stumbled closer, his eyes darting nervously from Jonas to Bledsoe. I kept," Everett stammered, holding the paper up like a fragile relic. "From the day you forced Mr. Callahan to sign over his land, you had soldiers at his door, rifles aimed at his wife and child." The murmur of the crowd deepened, darkened. Faces turned from confusion to recognition, then to outrage. Everett's voice cracked as he finished. I wrote it down. I couldn't forget. I thought it would never matter, but God help me, I kept it." Nahla's eyes widened as Everett placed the wrinkled document in her bound hands. The paper was blotched with old ink, water-stained, edges curled with age. Yet the words, jagged, desperate, spoke clear enough. She raised it high above her head, her voice gathering strength. "This," she cried, turning slowly so every face could see, "is the truth they tried to burn, not with fire, but with fear." The words cracked open the square like thunder. For the first time, the townsfolk lifted their heads. They looked at each other, then back at the stage, whispers swelling into a restless wave. Men who had stood silent shifted uncomfortably. Women clutched their children tighter, not in fear of Nahla, but of what Bledsoe had hidden. Jonas stood at the edge of the gallows, his body taut, every muscle ready for the storm he knew would follow. Yet he did not draw his gun. The weapon in the square today was not iron or lead. It was ink, memory, and courage. Bledsoe's eyes narrowed, fury breaking through his polished veneer. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped, and the man beneath was revealed, desperate, cornered, dangerous. The square fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a crowd ready to hear the truth, and the truth had just been spoken. For a long hanging moment, no one moved. The square was taut as a bowstring, the truth dangling like a spark above dry timber. Bledsoe stood rigid, his face darkening, but it was the townsfolk who shifted first. An old farmer, stooped with years of toil, shuffled forward from the safety of the crowd. His hat trembled in his hands, his voice cracked like brittle wood. But he spoke. "He took mine, too," the man rasped, lifting a finger toward Bledsoe. "Brought soldiers to my door, said my deed was invalid. My wife begged him. She never forgave herself for opening that door." His eyes glistened. "We've lived in a shack since, all because I wouldn't sign." The air shuddered with a ripple of whispers. Faces that had been blank with fear now stirred with recognition. Then a young woman broke from the cluster, clutching a small child against her hip. She squared her shoulders, though her voice shook. "My husband, Jeb, made him sign a note we didn't owe, a debt that never existed. When he refused, they beat him half to death and left him in the street. He walks with a limp to this day." Her child whimpered. She hushed him gently, then lifted her gaze in open defiance. The crowd's murmur swelled. Bledsoe barked, "Lies!" But the word rang thin, powerless against the rising tide. Another man, broad-shouldered, pushed through. A rancher with calloused hands and eyes hardened by years of silence. He held up a paper, creased, dirt-stained, the kind of debt slip Bledsoe's men had wielded like chains. Without hesitation, he tore it straight down the middle. The rip echoed like a shot. Then he shredded it again and again, scattering the pieces to the cold wind. The fragments fluttered like ash, landing in the mud at Bledsoe's boots. "I'm done living under your shadow," the rancher said, his voice ringing louder than the church bell that should have marked the Sunday hour. "No more." A roar went up, ragged at first, then growing, gathering strength. Feet stomped against the wooden planks of the boardwalks, boots thudded in the dirt. The chant was uncoordinated, but its meaning was unmistakable. The silence that had bound the town was shattering. Bledsoe's face flushed crimson, the veins at his neck rising as he bellowed for order. But for the first time, no one obeyed. Windows that had stayed shuttered all morning now creaked open. Men and women leaned out, voices adding to the storm. Even children, clinging to their mothers' skirts, raised small fists and echoed the cry. Jonas stood at the edge of the gallows, his chest tight, his breath caught. For months he had carried his fight alone. Now he watched the dam break.
A society that had hidden behind curtains, swallowing its fear, was standing, one voice at a time, beside him and Nahla. The square thundered with life, with fury, with something like hope. And for the first time, Jonas realized he was no longer a lone man against the world. The world was beginning to stand with him. The square had become a storm, voices crashing like thunder, but then quiet. A single figure moved from the back of the crowd. Reverend Cole, frail and stooped, shuffled forward with his black coat fluttering around his thin frame. His hands trembled as he raised them, his white hair stark against the bright morning sun. For months he had preached caution. For years he had kept his sermons free of politics, warning his flock to pray for peace while injustice walked their very streets. Now his lips pressed together in resolve. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Jeb Crow. His voice, though quavering, carried across the square. "This man," Cole swallowed, then steadied himself. "This man is no marshal. His badge," he drew a ragged breath, "his badge is forged." The crowd gasped. All eyes darted toward Jeb. Nahla was the first to see what the others had missed.
Her gaze locked on the blood-smeared tin pinned to Jeb's chest. "Look!" she cried, her voice sharp as a blade. "The engraving! Wrong!" She spoke in Apache first, then repeated in English for all to hear. "The seal of the territory. It is missing the star within the eagle." Every head turned, every eye narrowing, zeroing in on the small but damning detail. The badge was scratched, dented, the design etched poorly compared to the crisp official mark. Under the morning light, the lie gleamed plain as day. Murmurs swelled into shouts. "It's fake! He's no lawman! We've been fooled!" Windows rattled as fists pounded on wood. Jeb's face drained of color, sweat rolling down his temple. His hand hovered near his revolver, fingers twitching. He barked, "Lies! This is the work of traitors and savages!" His voice cracked with desperation. But the tide had turned. For years he had leaned on fear, on the weight of a badge no one dared to question. Now, stripped of its authority, he was only a man cornered in front of a town that no longer believed. The Reverend's voice rose once more, steadier now, emboldened by the gasps and shouts of his people. "I have seen the records."
There was never a Marshal Jeb Crow appointed to this district. You were a hired gun, nothing more. You preyed on their silence, on my silence. His voice broke, but he did not stop. And for that, I confess, I too have sinned. The admission hit the crowd like a hammer. Even Jonas, standing tense at the gallows edge, felt the air shift. All around, the townsfolk pressed closer. They no longer averted their gaze.
They stared, eyes blazing with a mixture of shame and fury. Mothers clutched children to their sides, fathers clenched fists. The false authority they had obeyed for years was unraveling thread by thread. Jeb snarled, spittle flying. "You think a trinket makes me less dangerous? I'll show you who's in charge." His voice dissolved into guttural rage, but the crowd did not recoil. For the first time, the lie was dead in the open, his mask ripped away, the false ally revealed. For a long heartbeat, the square trembled on the knife's edge between revelation and chaos. Dust swirled in the still air, voices clashing in confusion. Then Jonas moved. He strode forward through the press of townsfolk, their bodies instinctively parting to let him pass. Jeb stood frozen, sweat streaking down his face, the counterfeit badge gleaming dully on his chest. Jonas's boots struck the boards like drumbeats of judgment. Without hesitation, he seized Jeb by the collar, driving him to his knees. With his other hand, Jonas ripped the tin star from the man's vest. The metal tore free with a shriek, leaving fabric shredded in its wake. Jonas held the badge aloft, his voice cutting across the square like a whip. "Here," he thundered, eyes burning into the crowd, "is your marshal." A roar burst from the onlookers, half fury, half relief, as Jonas hurled the false badge to the ground. The sound of metal striking dirt rang sharp, final, undeniable. And then, as if heaven itself confirmed the act, the church bell tolled. A deep, resonant clang rolled over the rooftops, shaking glass panes and rattling the bones of every soul present. No one had touched the rope, yet the bell sang, each peal striking like a judgment from on high. The people gasped, some crossing themselves, others shouting in awe. The old order had cracked. Fear, once the town's keeper, had broken. Bledsoe's face went ashen. His hand darted to his revolver, desperation blazing in his eyes. "No!" he snarled. "This ends my way." Jonas barely had time to register the movement before the gun flashed. Instinct and resolve fused. He twisted, dragging Jeb down as Bledsoe fired. The shot cracked the silence, splinters leaping from the gallows post. Jeb, wild with panic, tore free and yanked his own pistol, firing blindly into the screaming crowd. People dove for cover, barrels rolled, chickens scattered in a frenzy. But Jonas was already moving. He pivoted, leveled his own Colt, and returned fire. His first shot struck Jeb square in the chest, spinning him back against the post he had meant for others. The forged badge lay at his feet, smeared now with blood and mud. Bledsoe roared, firing again. Jonas dropped low, the bullet shrieking past his ear. He rose, fired once more. The round hit true. The captain staggered, eyes wide, before crumpling onto the planks, his pistol clattering useless beside him. The gun smoke curled thick and acrid, veiling the square in a gray haze. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the ringing of the church bell, tolling its last mournful note. When the haze thinned, both oppressors lay sprawled in the dust. The counterfeit law, the hollow authority, lay shattered beside them. Jonas stood in the center, chest heaving, pistol lowered. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what had been done. There was no turning back now. Reverend Cole stepped forward, raising his quivering hands to the heavens. His voice, cracked with age, yet radiant with conviction, rose like a hymn. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." The words washed over the crowd, steadying their hearts. Mothers lifted their children, men drew long breaths, the people at last daring to believe justice could live here. In the dirt lay the false badge, half buried in the mud. It would never shine again. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The smoke from the gunfight still lingered over Dustwater Square, but its people were already shaping something new out of the ruin. The false marshal lay cold, the false order broken, and with his fall came the space for truth to breathe.
Word spread quickly, across clapboard storefronts into Apache camps along the river, that the treaty Bledsoe had hidden was real, signed, sealed, and now undeniable. No one could erase it any longer. The first act under its restored promise was simple yet bold, a station of healing, built not on the edge of town, not out on the reservation, but in the very middle ground between. Day by day, timbers were hauled, stones laid. White carpenters and Apache builders worked shoulder to shoulder, their hammers striking in rhythm. From the windows rose the scent of crushed herbs alongside clean linen, Apache medicine sharing space with a frontier doctor's supplies. The building became more than walls. It was proof that wounds, if tended, could close. Jonas stood on its steps, watching Nahla carry a pail of water to the doorway. A few months ago, she would have been a hunted shadow. He, a man too broken to care. Now, neighbors nodded to them with a mix of awe and quiet gratitude. Children, blonde-haired, dark-haired, their laughter mixing, chased one another through the dust where gunfire had echoed only days before. For the first time, Jonas felt the weight in his chest lift.
Not because justice had been spoken from a pulpit, nor because bullets had chosen sides, but because justice had taken root in something real, something lasting. He and Nahla had not only survived the storm, they had become its bridge. The town square filled not with shouts of fear, but with the low murmur of prayer. Dustwater had chosen a day to remember its dead, ranchers, settlers, Apache kin, whose blood had seeped into the same soil. This was no funeral for one man, but a rite for many, an attempt to stitch torn ground back together. At the heart of the gathering stood the church, long battered and silent. Its bell had not rung in years, the rope frayed, the clapper rusted still. But today, men and women from both sides crowded the steeple. Apache hands lifted timbers, while townsfolk balanced ladders. Together they mended the old iron frame, spliced new rope, and set the bell ready to sound once more. Jonas held the rope's end for a moment, rough fibers digging into his palms. He glanced to Nahla, who stood beside him, a quiet strength in her eyes. With a nod, they pulled together, and the bell pealed across the valley, deep, resonant, unlike anything the land had heard in a generation. People gasped, some wept. It was the first time Apache ears and settler ears shared the same note of mourning and hope. As silence settled, Nahla's voice carried, soft but clear, a verse spoken more to Jonas than to the crowd. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:21. The words lingered in the air, binding grief into something gentler. Neighbors pressed Jonas's shoulders, some whispering thanks. For years he had been the loner, the man no one invited or trusted. Now no one looked at him with suspicion. Instead, he was seen as part of Dustwater, a man who had carried weight for all of them. The label of solitude was gone. The sun dropped low, spilling copper light across the horizon. Dustwater lay quiet after the day's gathering, the sounds of hammers and voices fading into crickets and the hush of evening wind. Jonas sat on the porch of his cabin, boots resting on the rail, a silence that no longer pressed on him like exile, but felt almost like peace. Nahla came out, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She sat beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, but not quite. For a long while, they simply watched the sky darken, stars piercing through one by one. The girl's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "You saved me." Jonas turned his head, studying her profile in the last of the light. The words caught in him, not because they weren't true, but because they weren't the whole truth. His throat tightened. "Maybe you saved me too." For years, his nights had been filled with nothing but the echo of his own grief, the silence of a home without laughter. But now, sitting on this porch, hearing her breathe, knowing others in town no longer turned away, he felt something shift inside. Nahla leaned her head against the post, a small smile on her lips. He didn't need to say more, and neither did she. The land stretched before them, wide and uncertain, but it no longer felt empty. Jonas exhaled, slow and steady, as if laying down the weight he'd carried alone for too long. His voice was quiet, nearly lost to the night air, but sure. "This is home." The words lingered, not as a claim of property, but as a truth of belonging. Two lives rescued, bound not by blood, but by trust, by choice. And for the first time, Jonas believed it. Morning broke clean and sharp, the sky washed in pale gold. Jonas had just stepped outside, coffee tin warm in his hand, when the sound of hooves echoed up the dusty road. A single rider appeared, blue uniform catching the light, one of the cavalry. His horse was lathered from the hard ride, flanks dark with sweat. The soldier dismounted stiffly, eyes scanning the quiet cabins and smoke curling from cook fires. He reached into his satchel, pulling out a folded packet sealed with the government's crest. "Message from Santa Fe," he said, voice clipped, carrying the weight of something larger than himself. He handed it to Jonas, as if Jonas had somehow become the one people looked to. Jonas broke the seal. The words inside were formal, stamped in ink, but the meaning was plain enough. New claims had been filed, silver veins discovered in the hills north of the valley. A railroad survey team was being dispatched. The land that had just tasted peace was about to be carved open again. Behind Jonas, Nahla had stepped out quietly, watching him read. She saw the shadow cross his face before he could mask it. He folded the paper slowly, sliding it back into the envelope, but the weight of it remained in his hand. The rider tipped his hat, remounted, and spurred off toward the next town, leaving only a trail of dust in the air. Jonas and Nahla stood together on the porch, the silence between them no longer empty, but heavy with unspoken understanding. Peace had been won, but peace was never permanent out here. The horizon stretched wide, shimmering with promise and danger alike. Jonas tucked the letter into his coat and looked out at the land. Some battles were finished, others were waiting. And friends, that's the way of the frontier. Just when folks thought they had secured a future, new trials came riding out of the horizon, whether in the form of railroads, mines, or the relentless pull of greed. It reminds us that in life, too, peace and hardship walk side by side, and every generation must choose whether to guard what is right or surrender to the easy path. As you reflect on Jonas and Nahla's stand, perhaps you see echoes of your own struggles, moments when courage, compassion, and faith lit the way through uncertainty. That is the heart of true Wild West stories, not just the gunfights and dust, but the enduring question of who we choose to be when tested. If this tale stirred something in you, I invite you to subscribe, share it with a friend, and join us again. Because out here, every story carries a lesson worth remembering.